So far in this mini-series, we've talked about how the Bible was written by human authors under the inspiration of God, and how scribes were meticulous in copying these manuscripts to make sure that they match the originals. We've also talked about how the Bible isn't just one book, it's actually a collection of 66 books, and it's divided into the Old Testament and then the New Testament, and was written by 40 different authors. Okay, so now we're going to get into how, or if, we can have confidence that the manuscripts that we base our Bibles on today are anything like the original manuscripts. It's been nearly 2,000 years, so it's a fair question to ask. Getting into it, there are experts whose entire job is to evaluate the authenticity and reliability of ancient texts. And this is not just religious text, it's all ancient texts. And these experts are called textual critics. And some key questions that they consider when they're analyzing texts, ancient texts, include how many copies or manuscripts do we have? When were these copies made? What differences or variants exist between the copies? And then, do we have any evidence either from within the text or from outside sources to support the copies? Okay, so let's zoom in on these questions and see how the Bible measures up. First up is, how many copies or manuscripts do we have? And then, more copies of a text are beneficial because they increase the likelihood of preserving the complete content. As an example, if one manuscript is missing a page but another includes it, then scholars can piece them together to reconstruct the full text. As well, having more copies allows scholars to compare variations and cross-check them for errors. For instance, imagine that you only had 2 copies of a text. And in the same place, one says, I'm American, and the other says, I'm Armenian. It would be difficult to determine which wording was correct. But if you had 100 copies and 99 of them said, I'm American, while only one said, I'm Armenian, it would be reasonable to conclude that I'm Armenian is a copying mistake and that I'm American is the correct text. Okay, so I want to talk about how many copies of the Bible we have. But since we are not textual critics, most likely, just seeing a number might not tell us much. Like, is 10 copies a lot? What about 100? So to put it in perspective, I'm going to compare the Bible to 2 other ancient texts that you might have heard of. Sophocles' plays, which include Greek tragedies like Oedipus Rex, and then the second one is Homer's epic poem, the Iliad. So even if you're not familiar with these works, they are widely considered reliable and accurate to the originals, so much so that they're often required reading in many high schools. They definitely were back when I was in high school, and I double checked and they still seem to be on the required reading list for students in AP Lit these days. Okay, so for Sophocles' plays, we have about 120 early manuscript copies. And then the Iliad by Homer, which is the second most well-attested ancient text, has an impressive 1,900 copies. But guess what? The most well-attested ancient text is actually the Bible. Just for the New Testament books alone, there are over 5,100 handwritten Greek manuscripts. This doesn't include, the number of early manuscripts that were translated into other languages. And then it's worth noting that these numbers can grow as new manuscripts are discovered. In fact, I recently saw a scholar mention that there are now close to 5,700 Greek New Testament manuscripts. But since I haven't personally been able to verify that yet, I'm going to stick with the more conservative number. Okay, so let's move on to the second question. When were the copies made? Now, copies that are closer to the original text and the events that the original text describe reduce the likelihood of errors or distortions that can accumulate over time. So whether that's accidental or intentional, right? If you were to write about your last birthday, you'd probably record it more accurately today than you would 20 years from now, and certainly more accurately than someone else would 200 years from now. So Similarly, early copies are less likely to reflect intentional changes, such as alterations, made to align with personal or cultural or theological beliefs. And an example of this is that Thomas Jefferson infamously created his own version of the Bible by literally cutting out sections of the New Testament that he disagreed with. So this is why having many copies of the early manuscripts, as well as copies that are as close to the original as possible, is important. Okay, so the dating process isn't perfect, but textual critics usually can estimate a manuscript's age within a century or two, and then they do this by analyzing the handwriting styles of the manuscript and then comparing them to ancient documents that have dates on them, like legal records. They also consider the archaeological context where the manuscript was found, and then in some cases they might even use carbon dating to help refine the estimates. So based on these techniques, based on current estimates, Sophocles' plays were written between 496 and 406 BC, and then the earliest manuscript we have is from the 3rd century BC, which is about 100 years after the original. For the Iliad by Homer, it was written around 800 BC, with the earliest manuscript dating to 415 BC, meaning that there's a time gap of about 385 years. And I just want to again say that these texts are both widely trusted today, even with those gaps. Okay, sorry, this is a long one. Okay, so now when it comes to the New Testament, it was written between AD 50 and 100, and then the earliest manuscripts that we have are from AD 100 to 200, which is just 25 to 50 years after the originals. And this is huge because it means there were still eyewitnesses alive who could challenge the claims in the New Testament if they weren't true. But we don't see this in other ancient documents at the time. When talking about the New Testament, Frederick Kenyon, who is the former director and principal librarian of the British Museum, he said that the interval then between the dates of original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible. So I also want to address the other important question about dates, which is how close to the original events were the manuscripts written? And then to answer this, we can look at evidence from early church leaders, as well as what the Bible includes and doesn't include in its text. So, for example, Clement, who was the Bishop of Rome, wrote a letter to the Corinthians in AD 95 that cites verses from many books in the New Testament, including the Gospels, Acts, Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians, Titus, Hebrews, and 1 Peter. There's also Ignatius, the Bishop of Antioch, who wrote letters in AD 115 to several churches in Asia Minor, where he's also referencing passages from the New Testament books. And this includes books like Matthew, John, Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, and Titus. And so these quotes from early church leaders tell us that the New Testament books had to have been written within the 1st century AD. Since something needs to exist before you can quote it. But there's evidence in the text itself that provides hints at when it was written. One example is that the book of Acts ends abruptly with Paul in prison, awaiting trial. This is in Acts 28, Acts chapter 28, verse 30 and 31, if you want to check it out. And then this suggests that Luke wrote Acts during this time before Paul's trial before Caesar, which happened around AD 62 through 63. So something else to consider is that there's no mention of the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And that's a big deal because the books Matthew, Mark, and Luke record Jesus predicting or prophesying that the temple and city would be destroyed within that generation. So if the New Testament was written after AD 70, it would almost certainly highlight this fulfillment of prophecy. It'd be weird not to. There are plenty more examples I could share, but the takeaway I'm driving at is that Luke and Acts were written within 30 years of Jesus's ministry and death, and that's not enough time for a legend to develop. As I already mentioned, eyewitnesses to the events described in the New Testament were still alive and well and could challenge any false claims. And as I mentioned, we just don't see this. So the other questions textual critics asked to determine if an ancient text is reliable, that included what differences or variants exist between the copies, and do we have any evidence either from within the text or from outside sources to support the copies. I talked about variants in an earlier video and encourage you to check that out if you haven't already, but I'm going to summarize it here. So the high level overview is that there are lots of variants, but 99.8% of them are nonsense errors like spelling John with one N instead of two N's. There is not a single variant that affects a core Christian belief. So rather than hurting Christianity or the Bible, the number of copies and variants actually give us greater certainty that the Bible was very well preserved. And then as for the questions about whether there's evidence to support the manuscripts, either from within the text or outside sources, the answer is yes. And we're going to keep chipping away at that in the next few videos. Initially I thought this would just be a few video series, but there's so much more to say. Every time I create one video, I'm like, oh, I need to split this into two. So if you would like to follow along, you can subscribe to this channel, and then you'll see all of them. So in the meantime, I just want to leave you with a quote from the scholar John Warwick Montgomery. He says, "To be skeptical of the resultant text of the New Testament books is to allow all of classical antiquity to slip into obscurity, for no document of the ancient period are as well attested bibliographically as the New Testament." If you have questions about this video or topic, or any questions about Christianity in general, you please leave a comment with those questions, and I'll answer there or in a future video. And if this topic in particular interests you and you want to go deeper, I highly recommend the book Why Trust the Bible by Amy Orr Ewing. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've linked to this book in all of my descriptions, and a lot of what I'm saying in this series is borrowed from that book. So thank you, Amy. And that's it for today. So I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next week. Thanks.